This week, week 6, we're talking about muscles, and I'm going to get out of the way so we can take a look at the learning objectives. First, we want to differentiate the characteristics of 3 types of muscle. There's striated muscle or skeletal muscle that connects your long bones and allows for more mobility. There's cardiac muscle, which is used to pump your heart. And there's smooth muscle, which is involuntary muscle that operates inside of you in your gut, and the automatic functions of breathing and the automatic functions of peristalsis, of digestion, and so forth. Now, Paul Anderson, great video that is relatively short and does a good job right here. Here's the URL, and I'll give the link to you. When we talked about homeostasis, muscles and nerves cannot operate properly without a proper balance of electrolytes in your system. And in order for a muscle to contract, it needs to get a signal from the nervous system. You have to have a normal balance of electrolytes in your system for that to work right, because there has to be a differential maintained between the inside and outside of these cells. And the same is true of calcium. So calcium in the interstitial fluid is 200 times more concentrated than calcium is inside the cell. So for a muscle cell to contract, calcium has to rush in, and that depolarization pulse that travels across the cell membrane allows calcium ions to rush in, and that allows muscle contraction along with the use of ATP for the energy part of that reaction. So the connection to health is, I want you to think about things that happen to you. For example, if you get dehydrated, then you may also lose salts or electrolytes. But if you get too dehydrated, what happens? It changes the concentration of electrolytes in your body. And that means that if they get too far out of balance, your nerves won't work properly and your muscles won't work properly. So if your blood calcium falls too low, guess what? You'll have a heart attack and die. And in a less dramatic sense, what happens with dehydration or when electrolytes get out of balance? Well, you can get cramping, called tetany. So leg cramps are very common for athletes and people who aren't used to strenuous activity for long duration. You can also get disoriented in your mind, because with the improper electrolyte balance, your nerves do not work properly and your thinking is befuddled. And so often a person who is dehydrated sort of gets woozy and sort of loses it mentally, may vomit, may throw up, may have tetany in their muscles, and so forth. We don't see this problem as much today as we used to when I was a child. What is different? I mean, in terms of sports, when people are playing sports out in the hot sun or doing strenuous physical activity. And there's a reason for that. Do you know what it is? Can you think about what might have changed over time? Some of you may have guessed. Athletes don't drink water anymore. They drink Pedialyte. We call it Gatorade. So Pedialyte is an electrolyte solution that we give babies if they're getting dehydrated or have diarrhea to help reestablish normality in their homeostasis. And somebody decided to create a similar type solution for athletes to use, and we all use it now. We buy it in the store, we call it Gatorade, but it was first produced for athletes in professional sports. And that eliminated the problems that occurred from dehydration. Because dehydration, if replaced, continued physical activity is high, if you think about it, If you replace it, and you're losing salts by sweating, if you replace that only with water, then you also get electrolyte imbalance and you will get muscle cramps. And so a lot of times when you're getting muscle cramps, it can mean that you need to take potassium or some kind of electrolyte solution, or it could mean that you don't have enough water and you need to drink more water. And the fact is that a lot of us don't drink as much water as we should. To maintain proper nerve and muscle function and all other functions in your body, you should be drinking 8 glasses of water a day, which I don't do, but I try to drink more of it than I used to. And so not only will that improve your muscle and nerve function and your thinking, but it will also improve the digestive process and reduce or eliminate the constipation and so forth. So homeostasis of minerals, specifically electrolytes, is extremely important to muscle function. And Paul Anderson will get into that too, I'm sure. So let's go on to the next item. The gross anatomy of a muscle and the microscopic anatomy of a muscle fiber. Okay, so let's take a look at something that I have for you there, right here. So what we have is a diagram, and of course these are all over your textbook also, of how a cell or how a muscle is put together. And it's put together sort of like a cable system, okay? Now this here represents a single muscle cell, and we call it a sarcomere. And inside that cell, this would be a striated muscle cell because we have actin and myosin fibers that overlap, and we'll get to that soon. But this has to do with the sliding filament theory of how muscles contract. But then we take that muscle cell and we wrap it with a sarcolemma, and then we wrap a whole bundle of muscle fibers together with another sarcolemma, and we have a muscle bundle, okay? Then we take a bunch of those bundles and put them together, and what do we have? We have a larger complete muscle, okay? So this one's attached to a bone back here, but this is a cross section through the muscle showing the individual cell, the fascicles or bundles of cells, and then the bundles of bundles wrapped in that sheath. And of course when you eat meat, a lot of times you see that white fascia, and what you're seeing is this connective tissue that wraps these bundles of muscle cells together. Okay? So let's go back briefly, and I'll get a different diagram. Muscle fiber, myofibril, neuromuscular junction. So here is the nervous impulse coming in. We'll get to that in a minute, and how that action potential is generated. And then the action potential is chemically transferred across the neuromuscular junction to the sarcolemma, which is the wrapping of the muscle, or the membrane of the muscle. And then that action potential is propagated across the muscle cell membrane, which allows then the electrolytes to rush inside of the muscle cell. So we can see this cross section here. There's the myofibril. There's a synaptic terminal here with the red dots represent vesicles with acetylcholine in them. And that acetylcholine is released when that action potential from the nerve reaches the end. and then travels across this neuromuscular junction and initiates the action potential there at the muscle cell membrane. So inside of this muscle cell bundle is interstitial fluid that contains calcium and sodium that's going to eventually rush in to this muscle cell to allow contraction. Contraction means that the actin in the blue and the myosin in the red fibers slide across each other to create a muscle contraction. And I want to take a look at this. So if we have a muscle cell stacked upon a muscle cell, stacked upon a muscle cell, stacked upon a muscle cell, and ad infinitum up to however many we can have, you'll notice that when we talk about skeletal muscle, we talk about it being striated. It's because of the overlap of this actin and myosin that a histologist will see when he takes a thin slice of tissue and puts it on a slide. That's why it looks like it's banded. And you can imagine that this muscle cell has this little bit of contraction. It's infinitesimally small, but if you sum up all of the contractions of all of the different muscle cells that are in a myofibril, and you can see that the motion could accumulate to be rather large, a fairly large distance, a fairly large contraction. And then when you put hundreds of muscle or myofibrils together in a bundle, then that would add strength to that contraction. Now, what we should also remember is that striated muscle is multinucleated, which means that it gets bigger from stress. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you can have, muscles do not grow by adding cells. Muscles grow by getting the individual cells bigger, and to handle all the activity, mitosis causes the nuclei to divide. Remember, mitosis is the replication of the nuclei, not the replication of the cell. So in this case, the muscle cells get bigger, and to be able to handle everything that they need to do, they have multiple nuclei. So they do undergo mitosis, but not cytokinesis. Okay, so we would see multiple nuclei in these individual muscle cells, and then we stack these cells on top of each other so that the sum total of the contraction can make a significant movement.